Today I will be comparing three different watercolor sets. One from Rosa, one from Winsor & Newton, and one from Koi. This will just be a basic comparison. I will be comparing the colors in the sets, how easily they re-wet, the pigment to binder ratio, how well they blend, and how well they lift. Rosa Gallery is a brand of professional watercolor paints made in the Ukraine. Today I'll be looking at the Rosa Gallery 12 color palette. The first thing I notice is the color selection, and I'm quite impressed with most of it. I like that you have a warm and a cool of all your primary colors as well as your greens and your browns. We're using yellow ochre as a brown in this one. I would like to have burnt sienna in as well. And I am a little disappointed that they put a neutral black in there. It's not too bad because it is a little closer to the Payne's Gray, but I would actually opt to have a Payne's Gray. And that's not a big deal because you can actually just pop out the pan and you can then replace it with the color of your choice. The other thing I like about this palette is all the colors come in a full-size pan. Well, almost. It's slightly smaller, but I like that they choose to do a large size because it's much easier to get your paint out. I find the colors are nice and vibrant. I do feel I have to swirl my brush in the palette a little bit more to get the very deep colors, but that is not an issue because they do come out and they're very nice. I will save the rest of my review until I have done my little mini pictures. The next palette I will be testing is the Koi. I'm using my 18 colors, but I'm only choosing the 12 colors that are in the 12 colors set so that it's an equal comparison. Koi watercolors are made by Sakura, and their sketchbox are made in China, but the tube paints are made in Japan. The first thing you'll notice with the Koi is that their pans are very small. They're even smaller than a half pan. So that does bother me because it makes it much harder with large brushes to pick up your color cleanly. As for the colors themselves, it's a pretty good selection. They also do a warm and cool in your primary colors and in the greens. I'm also given a yellow ochre and a light red for my browns. That is a little bit of a disappointment because I would like something like a burnt umber and a burnt sienna. In this set, I'm also given an ivory black and a Chinese white. The ivory black I have no use for. I would rather have a Payne's gray. The Chinese white I can use, but if I'm going to actually use some white, I tend to go and add Doc Martens pH, bleed proof white, or a white gouache. The other thing is it's not as easy to switch out the pans because they're all in one little tray. So you sort of have to pop it out and then get another color to replace it if you can. I don't find the color selection to be as nice as what was in the Rosa Gallery. I find the cobalt blue is a little bit more like a cerulean blue, and the greens are a viridian hue and permanent green pale. And I don't find that either is very natural, and I think I could mix a nicer green with what they've already offered me. I like the light red in this set, but as I said, I would prefer a burnt sienna, a burnt umber, and a Payne's gray. So for what I am getting as an overall palette, I don't find it as useful as what is offered in the Rosa Gallery. I forgot to mention that this is a student grade. I do find the colors are going on fairly bright, fairly dark, some more than others. I will finish this review once I have done the individual paintings. The final color palette that I will be comparing is Winsor & Newton Cotman brand. Now I am using from my set, but I have all the colors in the pan set of 12, with the exception of the Viridian Hue. I will be using a phthalo green, which is very similar. These paints are student quality and in half pans. The colors in the Cotman set that I will be reviewing are cadmium yellow pale hue, cadmium yellow hue, cadmium red pale hue, alizarin crimson hue, cobalt blue hue, ultramarine, viridian hue, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, Payne's gray, and Chinese white. As you've probably guessed, I'm quite happy with the color choice of this palette. I have my warms and my cools for my yellows, my reds, and my blues, which is always the most important because you want that in your primaries because then you can mix a huge selection of colors. I then have the Viridian Hue. I am using a phthalo green, so I can't really comment if it's quite right, but looking at the palettes from their website, it is a very similar green, so it's still not one I'd see in nature. But the yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and burnt umber, I'm very pleased with, and they have a Payne's gray. They also include a Chinese white, and I've already told you I tend not to use that. And the only reason I don't is because it's very transparent. And if I am going to use a white, I usually want something that will be a little bit more opaque, that will stand out a little bit more. I'm finding these colors are very easy to lay down. I'm getting a bright pigmented color, and it goes from that to a very nice light color, and I can get a gradual blend. I will reserve the rest of my review in comparison until I've done the 3 pictures. So for my comparison, I will be choosing 4 similar colors from each palette. I have put the palettes above in order of Rosa, Cotman, and then Koi. You can see when I do each palette what colors I'm using. For the Rosa, I am starting with the yellow ochre, the umber. I will also be using the cadmium red light and the cobalt blue. I will be using the same brush and the same amount of water for each of my paintings, and we will see how they go on. Now, I like how the Rosa goes on. However, I find the paint feels a little thin. And what I mean by that is I can actually hear my brush on the paper as I am painting. So it's not as creamy as I tend to like, but it does give a nice wash. The colors seem to be dark enough. What I don't like is, as you see, I just put a little bit of that red on there, and the paint had dried so quickly that the red wasn't really blending. So I'm having to dab it off so that it's not too dark. I'm now adding a little water just to see if I can blend it a little bit more. I notice it goes on nicely, but I'm having a little bit of trouble lifting the paint off of the Rosa, as well as blending it easily without oversaturating it. So for my Cotman, I am using the yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and the cobalt blue. So with the Cotman, I find that it is a little more pigmented, or it has more pigment to less water, and it flows very easily and quite creamy. I'm using the same amount of water as I used for the Rosa, and I'm finding when I put on the second color that it's actually blending much easier. I realized I forgot to paint my door before washing the palette. So I put a little blue and I am painting it now, and I realize I haven't quite put as much blue on the palette as I had. So I'm going to add just a tiny bit more, and then you can see how much more pigmented it is. I am adding Payne's gray or black depending on the set for my hinges. I'm adding the neutral black to the hinges, and then I'm going to add another layer of my cobalt blue just to darken my door so that they're both the same intensity. For my koi example, I will be using the yellow ochre, light red, the cobalt blue, and I realized by accident I used the burnt umber from my 18 set, which isn't included in the 12. But since it's just for some light accents, I'm not going to really worry about it. With the koi, I find that using the same amount of water and pigment as I have in the other examples, I am not getting as much pigment or intensity with the koi. It does spread nicely, it spreads evenly. I like how it feels, but I do have to mix in more pigment if I want to get the colors as dark, or I have to do more layers. My final thoughts. I find the koi is a nice beginner set, but it's a set I think you will grow out of fairly quickly. My preference for all of these is the Cotman. Even though it is a student quality, I find it blends beautifully. It lifts really well. I find that I do not have to mix a lot of pigment with water because the colors are nice and intense and there is not a lot of binder. It is more pigment to the color. I find it re-wets very easily and the colors are nice and intense. I like the Rosa very much for the color choice. I think that's very good. I like the size of the pans. It re-wets very well. I find you do have to mix a bit more pigment into the water to get the intensity to match the Cotman. I find it dries a little too fast so that it makes your blending a little bit more difficult, and I find that not all the colors lift easily. The koi I find is a good beginner set, but it blends very nicely. The colors are not as intense as the other two sets. I don't like the color choices as much in the set of 12. If you get the set of 18, then I think you'll get a better color choice and that will work better. It also blends and lifts well. If you've found this helpful, please leave me a comment. Thank you.